Okay, so just a quick screencast to sort of dig into some of the ideas of philosophy that we've been discussing in class to use for you to refer to as you work on your essays. This quote here is from Protagoras, and you might remember that Protagoras is a sophist, and this quote here captures the idea of sophists and their relativist view of things, their relativist viewpoint on philosophy. So this, again, emphasizing that this chart we're working with is not necessarily everything that you could possibly say about every philosopher, but it is a good primer, sort of a good outline of things. So anyway, getting back to the questions. Metaphysics, remember, metaphysics is what is the nature of the world? We could say what is truth, what is reality, where does the world come from, where does life come from, what is the nature of change, how does an acorn become an oak tree, or how does a mountain become a pile of sand, or how does a block of ice become water? What are the elements of the earth? These are the questions that metaphysics seeks to get at. Epistemology focuses on how do we know what we know. So we've been talking about things like we know because of observation, or the scientific method, or something we might call authority or faith. And then the third major category of philosophical questions, ethics, really digs into the idea of what is the right way to act and live in the world. What is a good life? Ethics is probably the philosophical question that you first encountered in your life when you thought about things like fairness. When you were maybe in first grade and worried about fairness on the playground at recess. In any case, getting back into the sophists, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The sophists, again, remember, the sophists believed that the world was constantly changing and flowing, and what reality is depends on how we perceive it, the moment in our lives where we perceive it. In other words, truth and reality really was relative or subjective to the person doing the observing and the conditions under which that observing occurred. We actually have given this a name called subjectivism, but really what's important is that the sophists dug into this idea of observations and interpretations of those observations is how we knew what we know. And they really would subscribe to situational ethics, that right and wrong depends upon the context. Some things can be right in one context and wrong in another, perhaps. So these are the sophists. When we look at the thinking of Socrates, we really focus on this idea that reality and truth is unchanging and immutable. In other words, there is one reality. If we perceive it different from one person to the next, it's because we're perceiving it differently. In other words, our perceptions are what is mistaken. The world of observations doesn't really work for trying to get at truth and reality. We need to use what we call pure rationalism, or the Socratic method, really digging deeply into questions about truth, and that's how we would get at truth. Socrates went one step further and to say that if personal virtue, right and wrong, and rules wouldn't be necessary if everybody, let me start that over. If everybody sought personal virtue, then society would be perfect. You wouldn't even need rules about right and wrong, or any need to enforce any rules, because in that sort of situation, if everybody was trying to live a good and just and ethical life by pursuing philosophy to tell them what that real, true, and ethical life would be, then we would have a perfect society. Plato, as we know, a lot of what we know about a lot of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. Plato really believed the same thing as Socrates. The true and unchangeable world is eternal, and the physical world is just fleeting. He also believed that the body is temporary, the soul is permanent, this idea of dualism. This isn't probably too surprising that the physical world is fleeting. In other words, the body is fleeting. The eternal world is permanent. And Plato is the philosopher who puts forth this idea of the forms, or the ideas. The forms are perfect versions of reality that are known only through rational thought and philosophy. Plato writes about how these perfect versions of reality exist in an area called the good. If you want to use the idea of heaven, you would be probably fairly accurate in describing the good as a kind of a heaven. Now, where do Socrates' ideas ends and Plato's ideas begin? It's hard to know. The sources aren't clear because, again, we don't have anything straight from Socrates' hand. But in any case, we do know that Plato and Socrates, we can kind of take their philosophy together because of that. The allegory of the cave, again, is the key idea that really demonstrates what Plato thinks about philosophy. His epistemology, in the physical world, senses are fine. Like, I want to walk down the street and not bump into things. My senses are good for that. But to know about the forms of the ideas, we need to use this Socratic rationalism. In his ethics, we're going to talk about this in more detail. He believed in the Republic. His book called The Republic really got at the idea that philosopher kings should be put in charge to pursue questions of justice, because really philosophers are the only ones who really could know justice, and that democracy does not work. It's a failure because individuals cannot rise above self-interest. Maybe from our point of view, a bit pessimistic, but there it is. That's what Plato believed. And then the fourth philosopher that you should be really digging into as you work on your essay analysis is Aristotle. And let's move him up a little bit more into the middle of the page here. Aristotle was really somebody who we would think of as maybe a scientist, cut and dried. He believed in elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And everything that we see in this world is a recombination of earth, air, fire, and water. No innate ideas. In other words, he rejected the idea of the forms of Plato. That, in other words, there is no form of a horse that exists in heaven. We know what a horse is because we've observed horses over and over again, and that it's our interpretations that allows us to make categories of this. Again, a rejection of Plato's ideas. He really relied very heavily on observation, inferences, interpretations, and the senses are most important. So whereas Plato believed that the senses were only good for things like, not bumping into things as you walked around, and the senses can fool you, Aristotle said, no, actually the other way around. If we just rely on pure rationalism, we can basically talk ourselves into anything. It's observation and what we might call the scientific method that is perhaps the best way of knowing things. And as regards Aristotle's ethics, some of you have already pointed out a little bit of hypocrisy in Aristotle. Aristotle thought slavery was fine, which is troubling to us because he also believed that happiness came from pleasure, freedom, and being a thinker. But he also really subscribed to this idea of something we call the golden mean, that a person to be truly happy needed to understand how to be moderate and exercise self-control. So don't work all the time, but don't play all the time. Exercise restraint, but indulge at the same time. So the golden mean is a term that has been ascribed to Aristotle's thinking of moderation. This is really kind of a Greek ideal too, not just Aristotle. So as you're thinking about your essays and you're trying to piece together what your metaphysics, your epistemology, and your ethics are, think about these four philosophers. Actually, the sophists are a category of philosophers. Think about these four philosophers and how they connect to your own thinking.